Hi, I'm Christian J, and this podcast concerns all women and hopefully impress on you that feminism is not good for women. Men's rights literature rarely focuses on what is good for women, so this is perhaps an unusual example. This podcast is especially important for women to listen to and understand, because I will explain how women have been very poorly served by the way of work and home balance framed by feminism, that not only affects men, but will clearly demonstrate how badly women have also been treated. I would like to talk about the blanket of destructive lies that have settled like deep snow on our society, and especially women. The blizzard that is feminism has been blowing over us for the best part of a century, and much of our current policy, home life, education and work life, all of vital importance to modern women, has been affected and stifled by deliberate misinformation. Has it served women well, as they expected? Or has it been a grand confidence trick? The trend of increasing education attainment and labour force participation of married women began at the turn of the 20th century, well before the modern feminist movement came about. The 1960s-style anti-male feminism assigned a particular meaning to these trends and drove them into a very specific direction. In my view, this direction has been almost entirely destructive. I will show this and invite you to respond. I will first establish that the labour force and educational trends were in place far earlier than is usually supposed, despite the lies that feminists deliberately tell. Second, I will describe what I believe are the most destructive aspects of feminist interpretation of these trends. Finally, I will describe an alternative approach to the question of work and family balance. I believe the approach I suggest will be more humane for women, men and children. Although the fact is not widely known, the ratio of male to female undergraduates in the United States was about at parity from 1900s to 1930. This is the opening statement of Harvard economics professor Claudia Goldin's 2006 paper on the subject of the gender college gap. It can be noted that the same can be said for most Anglophile countries, where the university populations comprised only a small percentage of school leavers up until the Second World War. She goes on to note that male enrolments began to increase during the 1930s and accelerated in the late 1940s as returning servicemen entered college on the GI Bill in the USA. The high point of gender imbalance in college enrolments occurred in 1947. But starting then, she shows, female college enrolments have increased relative to male enrolments until now. The intervening years saw a massive bias towards female enrolment with special fundings and programs throughout the education system from kindergarten upward. Today, and for the past 10 years or more, women undergraduates outnumber men on most campuses and in most disciplines in all Anglophile Western nations. Note, Goldin's starting date for the shift, 1947, a full 15 years before the publication of The Feminine Mystique, and nearly 2 decades before the founding of the National Organisation for Women in 1966. The trend towards the increased labour force participation of married women also began well before the feminist movement. The labour force participation began to increase around the turn of the century and after World War I, and accelerated in the 1940s. Contrary to popular myth, not all the Rosie the Riveters were sent home the day after the armistice. A large percentage of women workers continued to work after the wars. In fact, the acceleration in married women's labour force participation was so strong in the 1940s that economic historians dispute not so much the timing of the shift, but its cause. Feminist ideology was not the primary driver of women's independence, despite the claim that feminists make. That independence varied from country to country, but was driven by the substantial loss of life by men during the First World War, particularly in Britain and Australia, leaving many women without marriage opportunities. This propelled women into an enforced independence, which they took to with much courage and ingenuity, setting a pace that continued when once again men laid down their lives in the millions for hearth and home and women's safety. Now the destructive influence of feminism impacts. A purely economic account of women's labour force behaviour would predict some, though not all, of the changes that have occurred in family life. An economist might argue this way: because women can now support themselves economically, they marry later, have fewer children and are more prone to divorce. But this is only part of the story, in that we have choices about how to respond to the important social changes of women's higher education and careers much more than men do. In the 1960s, a group of Marxist women who called themselves feminists defined the meaning of these social trends and pushed them into a very distinct direction. Marxism contributed two big ideas. The first is that the relationship between men and women are necessarily characterized by conflict, with continual danger of dominance of men over women. The corollary is that men cannot be trusted. An intelligent woman takes care of herself financially and emotionally, and marriage is an institution that constrains and oppresses women. Anyone should be permitted to leave a marriage for any reason or no reason. Such was the contribution to stable and constructive family life that such women professed. The second idea is that sex and gender are fundamentally political categories and not biological categories, that so many people, predominantly but by no means exclusively women, accepted such a ridiculous proposition beggars belief. This is a One for All production, penned by Amfortas, verbalised by Christian J. This is part one of a two-part presentation.